Hi, I'm Courtney Darby, and this is Reading Progress and Dyslexia. I'm one of the co-chairs of Darien CPAC. We want to thank you for attending, and we want to say a special thank you to Darien Library and the educators who are joining us today. We also want to special note and appreciation to Assistant Superintendent Shirley Klein and Chris Tranberg, as well as Program Director Laura Straighton. Our questions today will be handled by Kelly DuPont, one of my co-chairs. And we are so happy to welcome back Dr. Margie Gillis. Dr. Gillis is the nationally recognized reading expert with more than 40 years of experience. She has worked at the policy level for the Connecticut State Department of Education. She is a founder of the nonprofit Literacyhow and a Haskins Laboratories research affiliate. And she is also currently a consultant for Darien's ELP. Margie, Dr. Gillis, welcome.
Thank you, Courtney. It's so nice to see you. So nice to be part of this webinar. And I'm happy to have those people joining us today virtually. And I want to thank both Courtney and Kelly from CPAC for inviting me to speak today, and thank you to Shirley and Chris and Laura for representing the Darien Public Schools and for the Darien Public Library. So always is a team effort, right? So reading progress and dyslexia during the pandemic. Just a quick background about me. I have had the pleasure of presenting to Darien folks several times over the last few years, and every time I've presented, I've really enjoyed my time with you all and have had some great questions coming from you, and I know you'll have questions for me to answer at the end of this presentation, so I'll make sure I leave plenty of time for Q&A. And just about me quickly, as Courtney mentioned in the intro, I have been working with children and adults for the last 45 years now. So it's been quite a journey. I've been very blessed to have amazing mentors and partners, teachers and administrators and parents to work with, because this is a lifelong process. My background is in special education. I've worked with children with dyslexia and other learning disabilities, but many children and adults with dyslexia. So I've learned a lot on the ground. And then in the last 20 years, we have, or I have focused more of my efforts on professional development for teachers. We work with teachers from pre-K, as Laura would tell you, all the way up through high school. One of the districts we work in, we do work across all the schools from pre-K through high school. And our mentors provide embedded support in the classroom for teachers, general education teachers, reading interventionists, and special education teachers. And the work that we do is really about empowering teachers with knowledge. We are basing all of our work on the science of reading, the research that has accumulated for nearly 50 years now. And we strongly believe that literacy is the key to opportunity. If you can't read, you will not succeed, most likely. So children are at the heart of all we do, and we believe it is a civil right to learn to read, and that by research standards and evidence, 95% of all children can be taught to read, and it's the teacher that teaches the child, not the programs. Certainly programs matter, and I will talk just a little bit about that this afternoon, but it's really the teacher, the knowledgeable and experienced teacher, who will make a difference in a child's life. I have three big ideas today. One is I want to talk about the reading brain. What do I mean by that? And how that reading brain has to be built over a period of time. My second big idea has to do with assessment, and really where I'm going to spend most of my time this afternoon, focused on how important it is to assess our students' reading skills, to know what to teach, and then to see if what we're teaching is actually working. And last, I want to talk just a little bit about how technology and our virtual learning environment has changed the landscape. And we're still learning about that. What are the best methods of instruction using technology, as well as not just instruction, but assessment, since that's a big focus of today's talk. So I'm going to start with a little bit about the reading brain. Marianne Wolf, who is now at University of California, is a leading researcher and neuroscientist. And I love this quote that says that every new reader has to come to reading with a fresh brain. Our brains are wired to speak, to see, and to think, but not to read. In order to read, we have to build a circuitry, a neurocircuitry, and rearrange the parts of the brain that are really designated for language acquisition. We have to use those areas of the brain to develop this neurocircuitry. And in fact, teaching reading is rocket science. We know that from years of research. It is not an easy thing to do for many children, including our children with dyslexia. So this is a cartoon of the reading brain, and it really just shows the areas of the brain, this is the left hemisphere, that are really those important areas that I mentioned that are used for language development. Okay, the frontal lobe where we learn pronunciation and articulation of sounds, the parietal lobe where we're associating those sounds with the letters, and the occipital temporal region, which is very important for the visual word form, or called the visual word form area, where we link everything, meaning, right, comprehension of the words, what they sound like, what they look like, so that we can read words fluently. And this slide shows pre-intervention, right, where the frontal lobe is activated. This is using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And we see metabolic activity in the frontal lobe, but not in this very critical area, the back occipital temporal region, that is really important for building that instant word recognition and reading fluency. And what we see here is that post-intervention, post giving the student the tools, the instruction they need to be able to read fluently, we're actually seeing activation in that part of the brain. And this is an indication that we are building this neurocircuitry. We tell teachers that they actually change brains. It's an incredibly empowering idea and concept, and we can see evidence of this from the brain research. I also want to mention that in order to develop this neurocircuitry, we have to pay attention to what writing system we're actually teaching children to read. In this case, it is an alphabetic system. English is obviously based on an alphabet. So learning to read requires the child to crack how their particular code works for their particular language. Certainly there are other writing systems. Chinese is based on characters and is called logographic, and Japanese is based on syllables. So depending on the writing system, we are going to teach children to read using that knowledge. So in this case, English is actually based on both sounds and on meaning. The sounds, if I say the word cat, you would say, how many sounds are there? You would say k, at, and you would know that each of those sounds is representing a letter, C-A-T. Well, that's great when there is a transparent one-to-one relationship between sounds and letters, but our language is also based on meaning or morphemes. So when we say English is morphophonemic, it's based on sounds and the word cat. But what about the word health? You can see the word written here, but if you were to tell me the sounds in health, you would say L, 4 sounds, 5 letters. Why do we spell health with E-A? Well, it's because the word health is based on the root heal. So again, important to understand our writing system. Now, I'm sure many of you have read a whole lot about the science of reading, and we've certainly heard from lots of experts in the field about the science of reading. This research includes how reading and writing develop, again, in different writing systems, why some children have difficulty learning to read and write, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and how we can assess and teach those important skills. And last but not least, of course, how we can prevent and remediate reading difficulties. So those are 4 things we've learned a lot about. What we also have to keep in mind is that reading problems occur as part of a natural continuum. So what causes good reading also causes poor reading, right? We don't need 2 theories to explain that phenomenon, only one. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what that looks like. The Literacyhow reading wheel is our attempt at capturing what the core components are of literacy instruction so that our teachers understand there are these aspects of learning to read and that each aspect has a different set of assessments that would be needed that we would need to use, as well as instructional methods. So you can see here phonemic awareness, phonics and spelling, syntax, vocabulary, morphology, and then the text comprehension and written expression. What I also want you to notice here is that at the core is oral language, because language is the foundation of learning to read, and our teachers learn how the structure of language relates to learning to read and write. Now, because today's talk is focused on students who are identified with dyslexia or who are at risk for dyslexia, I want to just have a definition here for you. I will not read this definition in the interest of time. Many of you are aware of it. A version of this definition is part of our policy in the state of Connecticut. So many of you are familiar with it. I have highlighted some important parts of the definition, including the fact that dyslexia is neurobiological, which I just described a little bit about, that it has to do with accurate and automatic word recognition. It impacts spelling and decoding. And these difficulties that students experience are the result of phonological processing difficulties, which I'm going to talk a little more specifically about. There are secondary consequences for dyslexia. If you're not reading, you're not building your reading comprehension skills. So reading comprehension ends up being impacted as well. And in some cases, if a child with dyslexia has a co-occurring attention difficulty and has difficulty with executive function, those students will also have difficulty with reading comprehension, because reading comprehension requires really strong executive function skills. The simple view of reading is something that I use to explain the 2 different components that are part of learning to read, right? And mastering reading comprehension. So it's based on this equation that reading comprehension is the product of language comprehension. That is the ability to understand what you hear, right? Or what is read to you. Not what you're reading, but what you're hearing and learning about at a listening level, and decoding. Okay, so you have to have both to be skilled reading comprehender, and that's why you have a multiplication sign. Those 2 skills, those 2 components are highly correlated, and you really need to be good at both to be a good to be good at comprehension. Individuals with dyslexia tend to have good language comprehension, but their decoding is problematic. And therefore, if you have LC as 1 times D, which is 0, let's say, your reading comprehension is going to be 0, right? Not exactly 0, but for purposes of illustrating the equation, I think you get the point. I also like to expand on that, that idea, that simple view by saying, well, even though it seems simple from an equation point of view, it's not that simple, because language comprehension and decoding are made up of lots of different strands. In this case, the rope depicts those strands. So at the top of the slide, you see language comprehension includes background knowledge, vocabulary, knowing the syntax, the sentence structure of the sentences that you're reading, requires good inferencing skills and knowledge of how print works and different genres. Okay, that's very different than the bottom of the rope that shows the 3 strands associated with word recognition. And those are phonological awareness, the ability to decode the words, sound them out, and then looking at every word or almost every single word that you come into contact with and recognizing it instantly on sight. And so the top of the rope looks at being strategic and metacognitive, right, in the use of those language comprehension skills. And the bottom of the rope looks at automaticity. How quickly can I lift the words off the page? And so to be able to be good at reading comprehension, you really have to, as it says here in the box on the right, fluently execute and coordinate those 2 different components. And looking at this continuum, what I want you to just notice is that it takes several years to have those strands of the rope tightly woven together, right? So that you can do this very important thing called read and comprehend what you read fluently and effortlessly. But it really does require at least 2, and in many cases 3, and sometimes longer years to be really good at the actual act of lifting the words off the page and learning to read so that you can read to learn in 3rd grade and beyond. Now, my second big idea today is to talk about assessment. And there are 4 types of assessments that we talk about when we discuss assessing reading. These are the 4 types. I'm really going to focus primarily on progress monitoring for today's talk, but you'll see that we have outcome assessments, we have universal screening assessments, which I will talk some about, and we have diagnostic assessments that allow us to dig deeper and get to more of the heart or the root cause of the problem and what are the specific skills that are missing. I also like to think about these assessments in this way. Some assessments are going to be done after, right? We teach the skills. These are called summative assessments that assess their assessment of learning, while diagnostic assessments are given before so that we identify the student's skills, strengths, and weaknesses. And the formative assessments, which I really want to focus on today, are those assessments that we give during the intervention and instruction to see, are the students learning what we're teaching? And to further elaborate, what is a formative assessment and why are they so important? Let's talk for a minute just about the difference between a mastery assessment, a mastery measurement, and a general outcome measure, because there are 2 ways that we can look at formative assessments, like I said, during the learning process. So we can look at mastery measurement that are skill and program specific, and we want to look at progress monitoring data to help us know if we need to change what we're doing. And in this case, some of the tools we use have reliability and validity, but they don't always have that, and that's not necessary for these mastery tests. But the assessments in this case don't reflect generalizability or generalization of the skills. That's where the outcome measures come in. So I'm going to talk more about these general outcome measures, like our screeners, don't necessarily measure mastery of skills. That's why we need both. I'm going to continue to describe this so you understand more about that. But before I do that, I just want to say very clearly that the importance of linking assessment data to reading interventions is critically central to doing this well. Lots of teachers do their assessments, but they have so much assessment data that they're collecting. They don't always look at it, in which I always say to them, if you don't have the time to look at it, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. Now, I don't like to say that too loud, because certainly the administrators who have made decisions about assessment in districts are doing it because they know they need to have that data to drive decisions, and that's absolutely true. But what I have learned over the years that I've been working in schools and districts, now going on my 21st year doing that, is that there sometimes is some redundancy. So we want to just make sure that we're using the most efficient process to get the information that we need. And we start with assessment measures that are linked to the components that I mentioned that were around the reading wheel. And then we look at the interventions and the instruction that is matched to those components, to each of those components, and the assessment information that we're using. We also know that the screeners that we use, and I'm aware of the fact that Darien uses Ames Web, which is a wonderful universal screener. A lot of the subtests that are used for those universal screeners are also good indicators for dyslexia, including letter naming, knowing the sounds and sound letter correspondences, phonemic awareness, phoneme segmentation, fluency. So a lot of, and oral reading fluency, these are all really great assessments. So you don't necessarily have to have a dyslexia screener as long as you have the components that are indicators that the student is at risk or should be identified with dyslexia. As long as you have that data, you can use a universal screener that you already have. Now, I use the word universal screener and CBM interchangeably because universal screeners are curriculum-based measures. And what does that mean? We're monitoring our students' growth within an instructional program. We're using the data to create instructional groups. We're differentiating using the data. We're identifying the students' skill deficits. We're screening students who are at risk. These are all the things that the CBM, the curriculum-based measure, helps us do. It also aids in eligibility decisions. It doesn't give us all the information we need, but it certainly is an important first step. And it does evaluate placement in special education and reintegrating students back into the regular education programs. And the nice thing about our screeners, most of them, if not, I would say most of them, have assessments that we can use both for screening and for progress monitoring. And so that's great because we want a cohesive data system, a cohesive assessment and data system. So let's talk a little bit about why it's so important to monitor our students' progress. Well, I mentioned that when we use the progress monitoring data, not if we just let it sit on a table, we don't get to analyze the results. When we use that data, students learn more because we're looking at those requisite skills that we want to make sure they're mastering. Teachers also design better instructional programs and their decision-making improves. And last but not least, as students get older and they're aware of the fact that their teachers are monitoring their progress, are vested in their own progress. And ultimately, that's what we want them to do, right? They're part of this, this whole process. And if they understand that their efforts linked to the teacher's efforts will get the best results, that's win-win. So progress monitoring is very important, as I said, to monitor the student's response to instruction. That's really the major reason for doing that. And looking at rates of improvement so that if students aren't making adequate progress, we can change what we're doing. These assessments should be valid and reliable and evidence-based. and administered during regular intervals, which will depend on the students and how large the gaps are, which I'll describe in more detail. You will be getting these handouts, and when you do, these will take you to a live link that will take you to a wonderful resource page, in this case, intensiveintervention.org, that will link you to a progress monitoring tool chart. This is just a screenshot of what you will see. And the tools that are on this chart will, most of them, if not many or most, meet standards that are that qualify them as being a member of the CBM family. So take advantage of that. You'll see more about that. Why is it so important that we're monitoring students' progress frequently? Well, to change what you're doing if it's not working. That's the whole point of these formative progress monitoring assessments. And because we want to make the most of every minute of instruction that you have with students. These assessments also will help us make decisions about, have we selected the correct instructional goals and the most effective materials? Is the student in the best group for advancement and working at his or her best, the level that's going to make sure that they continue to make the progress. These assessments also are very important for communicating the progress or lack thereof in some cases to parents. Parents, of course, need to know how their students are doing, and also to document progress for students who have to have periodic and annual reviews as part of their IEP. Now, earlier I mentioned mastery and long-term general outcome measures for progress monitoring. And it's important that we look at both of these when we're doing progress monitoring. The mastery assessments, criterion reference assessments, are looking at short-term mastery. We're measuring specific skills that we're targeting, and we can look at those as indicators that the student is making progress, right? But at the end of the day, we want to make sure the student is generalizing what they're learning and they're retaining what they're learning, and that they're actually improving in terms of their ability to comprehend what they read. So the criterion reference tests, also known as mastery tests, again, I'm not going to read all my slides in the interest of time, but you can read kind of how these criterion reference tests work. As I said, both mastery and long-term progress monitoring are very important, because sometimes, even though students have mastered these sub-skills, it doesn't generalize. And if it doesn't, we have to go back to the drawing board and see what's going on. Why are these skills, why are students having difficulty with some of those skills? And what can we do to ensure that they actually are improving in their reading and writing? Another question that we have to think about is how often we need to monitor progress. Well, the truth of the matter is, teaching, as one of my colleagues has said to me many times, teaching is assessing. If you have the opportunity to work with small groups of children, it's hard to do this with an entire class, but most of our foundational skill instruction occurs in small groups. And if you're in a small group, with 3 or 4 or 5 students, and you're really good at diagnostic teaching, meaning I'm watching my students, I'm observing, and I'm seeing the things that they can do relatively easily and that seem to be mastering, and those that they're not, we don't always have to whip out a formal assessment. We can actually do some of this informally. But we do also have to complement that with the standardized assessments, as I said. So again, it will depend on the students and where they are in their learning trajectory. And who does it, when and where? Anyone trained in the procedures can collect progress monitoring data. You have to be trained in the procedures. And if the assessment is meant to be done exactly this way, in other words, for reliability and validity, you have to follow the standardized directions to do that. So when and where is an important question. Is certainly very relevant now today with our virtual learning and some of our assessments having to take place this way, or, you know, through a screen. But we'll talk more about that. Because the virtual assessment is really important. And I know there's been debate around the country and certainly in our state that I have been part of. Do we stop assessing while students are out of the classroom? One urban district in the state that I won't name really chose not to assess the kids at the beginning of the year because they felt that they needed to figure out how they were doing socially and emotionally. And I made the case that we have to administer some assessments, because how are we going to know how much ground they lost, right? From March till September when they return to school. This information is incredibly important. And as this quote says, supporting learning process, albeit from a distance. Either way, we have to make our best attempt to do this. So you have a link here for from UNESCO, resources during the pandemic that I think you'll find helpful. I guess the other thing I want to say real quick before I move on is that we don't have a lot of research. In fact, to prepare for this talk, I looked high and low for some research that shows, can you assess students virtually in reliable and valid ways? And the answer is we don't know yet. We actually are doing some of this assessment virtually where we can't be face-to-face with students. And we're learning how to do it more effectively. So I think this is a process and we'll get better as we go. I think a lot depends on the individual students too. And that's something we need to take into consideration and factor in. So I know you probably will have some questions about that, but I think what I want to say here is the jury's out a little bit on this. I also think there are challenges with using the data and having the data process be part of what we're doing routinely in schools. And again, some of the districts that we're working with are having difficulty having their usual data team meetings. I don't know if that's the case in Darien, but I think what I want to say is it's really important not just to have the data, but to use it. So you'll see some slides here that'll show how we might want to graph the data. The grade level meetings are still important, and the problem solving meetings, the PPTs and other meetings where we're really looking very deeply at the data by child and making sure we're seeing progress. So this is just an example of what we would do to make sure students are making progress and then graphing it. This is data from a fourth grader, Adam. And this is just charting his words correct per minute. This is the trend line, right? So in January, we would expect him to be reading about 85 words correct per minute, but we want this to go up to 130 by the end of the year. And so you could see he started out doing pretty well, but he dipped below the goal line. And this is actually the goal line, sorry, or the aim line. And you can see if we're monitoring progress regularly, we're seeing how far below that goal line the student is and if we need to adjust instruction. So some of the questions we have to ask are, which students do we monitor? What measures do we use to monitor progress? What materials, how often, etc. In terms of the materials, when possible, we want to think about monitoring students using grade level materials, right? If it's not possible, let's say the student is fifth grader and he's reading on a second grade level, it may be too frustrating for him or her to be assessed with a 5th grade oral reading fluency passage. So for regular progress monitoring, just to see how he or she is doing on their grade level material, we would use that for progress monitoring, knowing that ultimately we would still need to have their grade level progress monitoring data as well. And in terms of what level you should be monitoring, again, it depends on the student, how far behind they are. Since we know accuracy is very, very important, we want to start with that. And this just is a guide for where we would start with progress monitoring based on the student's accuracy level. And certainly if the student is inaccurate in reading words, we want to monitor their instructional level just to see how they're moving at that level. Now, I just want to take a quick side, whatever we call this, a little, I don't know. Anyway, I want to spend a couple minutes talking about phonological processing, because today we're talking about students with dyslexia specifically. And for those of you who may not be familiar, I think most of you probably are, but if you're not familiar with what phonological processing is as the core difficulty associated with dyslexia, I think it's important to understand that. So phonological processing has 3 main skills that are associated with it. One is phonological awareness, that ability to segment, take words apart, put the words back together sound by sound, and then actually manipulate the sounds in the words. Phonological memory has to do with storing those sounds and being able to hold on to that information. So we assess that with a digit span task. And rapid naming or naming speed or processing speed is how quickly we can retrieve the name of something. All 3 of these things are really important in learning to read and write. And this is just a picture that shows those 3 skills: phonological awareness, which is really looking at phonemic awareness, this idea of blending, segmenting, and that manipulation that I'll talk a bit more about. And then phonological memory is the second piece, and the third is naming speed. What assessments would we use for phonological and phonemic awareness? Well, you use Ames Web for universal screener, and you have the phonemic segmentation subtest. For diagnostic purposes, you can see some assessments listed here. What is important to remember with regard to phonological awareness is that there are different levels of proficiency. And David Kilpatrick in the last few years has raised our awareness of the importance of developing students' phonemic proficiency, which means they have to be proficient at an advanced level of phonemic awareness to be able to read and spell and write proficiently. So this chart shows how that maps out. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this, but you'll have this as a reference for when you get your handouts later. To monitor phonemic awareness, we have, like I said, your Ames Web that will help, your CBM will help to see if they're generalizing the skill. For their criterion reference, the CRT, you have some assessments listed here. We also know that part of developing students' automaticity with word recognition skills is teaching them phonics, both decoding and encoding. And so I've listed here a few assessments that you could use for that purpose, both CBM, your screener, and your criterion reference, AKA mastery test. And just a word about fluency. We know that fluency has to do with automaticity. We know that many of our students with dyslexia actually have difficulty with fluency because of this idea of not being able to retrieve the name of something. They have slow processing speed. and this will impact their ability to read words automatically. So we do want to keep monitoring progress of reading fluency, and I've listed some assessments here. And we also want to acknowledge the fact that even though students may have good language comprehension, our students that have are identified with dyslexia, their reading comprehension may be a problem, because again, they're spending so much cognitive energy trying to lift the words off the page, they have nothing left to do the heavy lifting of comprehending the text that they're reading. So we want to make sure we're monitoring their comprehension. And we have the Ames Web again listed here, along with some other assessments that you can use. Now, what do we do if the student isn't making adequate progress? We have to change both the intensity and in some cases the nature of instruction. We have to look at what intervention we're using in the first place, and is it appropriate for the student's difficulties. We may not have given it enough time, so the duration matters. Also, how often they are seeing their teacher. So the more they see that teacher on a regular basis, hopefully daily, especially if they're behind, by a couple grade levels, that's going to matter. The frequency, of course, matters. As I said, the duration, how long the sessions last is the duration. So 20 minutes is not going to be as effective as 45 minutes, right? The interventionist matters. Does the interventionist who's delivering the instruction have the knowledge to be able to get the job done? And group size also matters. Especially when I talk about group size, what I want to say about that is, you can have a small group of 3 or 4 kids, but if those students are at different levels, it's really very challenging for the teacher to pace the instruction effectively. So you do want to consider that as well. Now, I mentioned that my third big idea was what has happened during the pandemic, right? That changes the landscape for our students who struggle with reading. And we know a lot has changed. One thing I just want to mention here is that researchers are looking at this. What is the impact? And is there a coronavirus or COVID slide? In other words, do students regress? And did they regress when they had to come out of the face-to-face learning and do their learning virtually? So we have a study that's being conducted at Haskins Laboratories with Famiko Hift at University of Connecticut that is specifically looking at this COVID slide. There are, certainly what we need to recognize when we talk about assessment is the best reading assessment tool is the teacher's knowledge of the research on reading, how the reading brain gets developed, what we do about reading difficulties, so that the knowledgeable teacher makes all the difference. You can have phenomenal, assessment tools, but if the teacher doesn't have the background knowledge to analyze the results of those assessments and understand what those results are telling them, then they can only go so far. I just want to end with a few references here that I didn't really mention other than this. Well, I did mention David Kilpatrick. This is an excellent resource for learning more about the assessment and treatment of reading difficulties. We have some information on our website as well. And then here are some other books that you would find, I think, helpful. And I've also shared here some resources. Again, these are live links to a number of websites that will build your knowledge of progress monitoring and take you to tools that I think will be most helpful. One that I just added today, actually, I just found this morning, is this particular link to the National Center on Improving Literacy. And there's several resources there for remote learning not necessarily assessment, but remote learning that I think you'll find valuable. And then these resources are specific to progress monitoring, and I think you'll find these very, very helpful. This is a study group content module about CBMs and how we use them for progress monitoring. And this one is a leadership team content module these are both excellent. And then last but not least, this is a link to the National Center on Intensive Intervention and resources that you will find helpful there. And on that note, I have 12:45 on the button, and I'm going to stop now to take questions that you may have.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Margie. That was so much information, and I appreciate that you're going to share the slides. There's some great websites that I think most of our attendees will be accessing. We've got a variety of different questions, and I want to answer one that just came in so I don't forget to do it. Which part of the simple model rope from the slide that you showed are impacted by weak executive function skills?
I love that question, and it's a really important one. I would say that the top of the rope is generally associated with difficulties with executive function because comprehension requires the student to use those executive functions, those skills that are really important in retaining information, holding on to information, thinking about what you've read, inhibiting your impulses. There's so many things that go into being able to do that, even at the listening level. But then when you add in the fact that the student has to actually read something, that requires them to even use more of those executive skills to manage. And as I mentioned, if they're not automatically lifting those words off the page, they're using their cognitive energy to do that versus what really requires the higher order thinking, and that's the comprehension. Now, having said that, there are also students that have naming speed difficulties and that are associated with processing speed that are sometimes associated with executive skills, and that may impact that bottom part of the rope too. But in general, we think about executive skills impacting comprehension most of all.
Right.
And writing too. I mean, we didn't talk about writing. Writing is also very, very much a part of that. And remember, the reading wheel had comprehension and writing in the same section because those two things are reciprocal. When you're reading something, you should be writing about it. When you write something, you should be reading what you wrote, etc. So they bootstrap each other, and they're very highly correlated.
Great, thank you so much for that. One of the questions, I know you mentioned the group size when it came to instruction. This was specifically for direct instruction at like the middle and high school. For students who need help with fluency. So how big should those groups be, or how do we know the kids are getting, making progress in these groups?
Well, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the group matters because there's so many things that go into having a good group. Dynamics, the relationships between the kids in the group, right? There's lots of research about that. But I think what's hugely important is getting kids that are similarly, that have similar skill levels. Because if you have a student that is 2 or 3 grade levels above where everybody else is, they're going to be bored. They're going to feel like, you're wasting my time. I don't need to be working on these skills. And conversely, you have kids, let's say you have 3 kids that are pacing beautifully and one who keeps struggling, they're going to get frustrated because their peers are doing well. So I do think matching those students is really important. And it's also true that as students get older and they've had difficulties and they're frustrated, and they're not reading because they can't read very well, we have to think about how to engage and motivate those students. That's a huge part of working with adolescents. And so it may be harder to do that when you have 7 or 8 kids in a group, right, versus when you have 2 or 3. So I think you just want to know, kind of think about what actually is working and look at the data. Data is really key.
Okay, so there's no magic number, like a group of 4 is the key. So it really, there's a lot that goes into it, and it's complex. It's not just, we're going to put these kids together and it's all going to work out. Okay, so that leads us to the question about us, the assessments. So I know the school district, they have, you know, the schedule. How often should they be done?
Progress monitoring?
Yes, the progress monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, the rule of thumb is that you should be doing it at least once a month.
Okay.
And if students are behind, more, you know, further behind, you need to do it more frequently. And the reason for that is because you don't want to wait too long. If the student's not responding, you want to tweak what you're doing, because especially as the students get older, you don't have time to waste. So you really want to do it. And it seems, you know, onerous. Progress monitoring, a lot of teachers are like, I just want to teach. I don't want to assess all the time. If we have to change teachers' mindsets about assessment, and we have to give them tools so that they know that they can do a lot of these things informally. I mean, I love looking at writing samples. I love having teachers look at authentic, you know, writing samples. That is an incredible window into phonemic awareness and, you know, the students' orthographic knowledge. Their assessments tell you, their writing samples tell you a lot. I don't even necessarily have to do a whole, you know, separate assessment. If I know a lot as a teacher, I can look at that sample and right away know what the student's retaining and what I need to reteach, so that I don't, you know, waste valuable time, you know, just doing assessment for the sake of assessment.
Right. Okay. The question, this could be a question for Shirley or Chris. Do the parents have access to the assessment results or the Ames webs? Because when a student starts in the beginning of the school year, you know, it's probably lower, that dips down. I mean, so the parents can see that their progress is being made. Does that make sense?
I don't know if Chris is joining us, but I know that during parent-teacher conferences, I know Ames web scores are shared with parents. And I know PPTs, we have our teachers present what those scores are. I think often that parents can reach out to their classroom teachers to have those conversations, but that's my understanding of when those scores are shared, parent-teacher conferences, and of course at our team meetings and our PPTs. But just to support what Margie is saying as well, the idea of authentic assessment, really using curriculum-based materials, using writing samples, using language that we're working on, those are ongoing forms of assessment we do. Very often they'll be shared at PPTs. Some families actually have work sent home and they exchange it so they're aware of what it looks like. So usually it's decided upon between the family and the case manager and or the general education teacher.
What should parents request if their child is significantly below grade level in reading?
In general, you want to have some diagnostic data. So today I really focus primarily on screeners and progress monitoring measures. I didn't speak as much about diagnostic assessments. Diagnostic assessments just give us more specific information that might not be part of the universal screener. For example, if a student has trouble with decoding, we want to know what patterns, what spelling patterns they can recognize, you know, well, and you know, how accurate they are in reading those words and those different patterns. And we have some really, you know, easy to administer diagnostic assessments that we recommend the teachers use to help with that. And so I just suggest that we learn more about what is driving the difficulties. In some cases, we would administer a more extensive assessment. Certainly for a student that we suspect has difficulty with phonological processing, we would probably want to administer a test like the comprehensive test of phonological processing, because it measures those 3 aspects of phonological processing, and it gives us some really valuable diagnostic information so we know exactly where to start. Some students have difficulty with one of the 3 aspects of phonological processing. Some have difficulty with 2 out of 3. And those students that are what we would call the treatment resistors, the students that have the most difficult time with these word recognition skills, may have difficulty with all 3 aspects. So that diagnostic data is going to be very, very important. Coupled with, like I mentioned, David Kilpatrick, he's developed an assessment called the PAST, Phonological Awareness Screening Test. It's pretty easy to administer, and it actually can be used for progress monitoring as well. So these are things that'll just give us a much clearer idea of why the student is struggling.
Okay, I'm going to shift to a little bit different question, but this came in. It was, my child is very anxious about reading and behind the rest of her class. She's dying to do chapter books, but is not a strong decoder. Any recommendations? Yeah,
so I think to some extent it depends on the age of the student. Right. But let's just say, for sake of argument, that it's a 3rd grader, and the 3rd grader has has gotten to a certain point and sort of reached a ceiling of being able to memorize words and read because they might have decent language comprehension skills. But many of our 3rd and 4th graders, hit a wall. So we would want to give that student some time to practice developing that accuracy and automaticity I mentioned earlier for word reading. And so there is a place for the use of decodable text where they can apply what they're learning with regard to the phonetic features and the structure of language. And it's just really for the purpose of practicing those 2 things, accuracy and automaticity. And it's amazing how kids will respond and say, oh my gosh, I can read. Now, once they get good at that, we can shift back to those authentic texts or texts that they're really excited to read, but before they couldn't read them because they were tripping over every 3rd or 4th word. So I would say, 2 things, like I said, find decodable text. For older students, High Noon has some great text that kids really seem to enjoy reading, and explain to them. It's like you're learning how to play the piano. These decodable texts are like practicing scales, right? Versus being able to play, Chopin. I can't do that. I can't read the authentic text unless I have some of those skills down. And really explaining it to the student is, I think, really important part of the process.
I know we're getting short on time, but a question that came through a couple times was, have there been advancements in early age identification? And I think that goes along with, the work you're probably doing it right here in our district. So I'm sure many of you guys can answer this one, but.
Well, let me just say really quickly that I'm very excited about the work that's being done in early identification. There's 2 really important research projects that are happening. One is at Harvard with Nadine Gobb and Early Bird, which is an app for 4 and 5-year-olds that will identify children who are at risk early. And the other is here in our home state of Connecticut, Famiko Haft, who's a researcher at UConn, and she and her colleagues are developing an app called Apprise. And so it's very exciting because truly prevention is the key. And now we have so much good data and information to find these students who are at risk. We won't identify dyslexia at age 4 or 5 because they're not reading. Can't identify dyslexia until children are reading, but we can identify that they're at risk. And that's very, very important for us to do.
A question that has, it's come up a couple of times. Should you, there's in-school assessments, should parents go outside and get outside assessments? Is that something they should be doing, or should you rely on what's being done at school?
If the district is doing their due diligence, then the districts, and more, I think, are doing a good job of administering a battery that is comprehensive. And beyond administering the battery, the most important thing is analyzing the data. Many districts, I think, in the past would administer the battery, but wouldn't analyze the data comprehensively enough to point specifically to what the students were struggling with. And I think it's the analysis that I think is most important. If the analysis is comprehensive and the analysis leads to specific recommendations that can be utilized by teachers, then there's no need for an outside evaluation. If you don't have that information, then you might need to find it somewhere. But I'm an optimist.
Great. Another question that came up was, how long are students, or should students be in SRBI before, I know it's a complicated question, before they move into a special ed? Does that make right?
Another really good question, because RTI was meant to take care of the wait to fail kind of scenario that happened when we were looking for a discrepancy between IQ and achievement. Now that we don't have that, response to instruction and intervention is really meant to get the right instruction for the student in as time sensitive and efficient manner as possible. However, we have to know that if we're looking at data that is flat, and or if the student is showing us signs behaviorally of being frustrated and needing something more, then we have to be sensitive to all of that and be willing to deviate from, okay, this is the RTI protocol, and call a PPT to look at the evidence that's accumulating and to get, take stock of where the student is.
What about online programs for the summer? I think this has come up a few times. Like, what's the summer? How are we going to catch up?
The summer is really important, of course, especially now. And I think that the summer is a wonderful opportunity to get students, more focused instruction over a period of time without all of the distractions, and also the requirements that students have to be in school 6 hours a day. And then on top of it, they have to have an intervention. So I think, again, all the things we talked about this afternoon would apply in the summer. It's just an opportunity to go deeper. And again, using diagnostic data to select a program or approach that actually is linked to what the students' needs are. And with an eye toward closing that gap, it can be done, and summer is a good time to tackle that.
Can parents take the test data from the school to an outside evaluator? Is that allowed? Maybe Shirley or Chris need to answer that.
Of course, parents have access to their students' records. And actually, when the student's 18, the student has to give parents permission to have those records. But yes, parents always have access to the records, and they're welcome to share them with outside providers.
Thanks, Shirley. And it's really important that they do that, because one of the reasons that you would want that is not to duplicate efforts, right? And in some cases, standardized tests are used and you can't administer them for 6 months. So you have to know what the requirements are for the assessments that are used.
Okay, and we'll do one last one, because this kind of goes hand in hand with this. What kind of professional would you recommend taking the district results to for further recommendations or analysis?
people that have had lots of experience doing evaluations. The qualifications, don't matter to me anyway as much, although districts do have requirements about qualifications. The importance is how much experience has the evaluator had with those specific students and their profiles. That really, I think, is the biggest factor.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're past time, and I think we're going to start losing people if we don't wrap it up. So on that, thank you all for participating. There's so much information. We will be sharing the slides, and that's where there's all the different websites and resources. So thank you to Shirley, to Laura, to Chris, and then of course to the library and Margie for putting all this time, and we do appreciate it, and the information's invaluable. So I don't know if Courtney wants to say anything else, but
we greatly appreciate it, Margie. Always an excellent, I learn something every time. You're fantastic.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I enjoyed being with you all.
Thanks.
Yeah, this was great.
Thank you
Take care,
all very
everybody.
much.